Napoleon's invasion of Russia in 1812 is one of the greatest turning points in world history, a story so shocking, so brutal, and so devastating that it still sends chills down the spine 2 centuries later. This isn't just a tale of war. It's a cautionary epic about human ambition, about what happens when a man who believes he is unstoppable collides with forces he cannot control. And here is the hook. Napoleon didn't lose because his enemies were smarter or stronger. He lost because of fire, snow, hunger, and time. And because he refused to admit that even he, Napoleon Bonaparte, Emperor of the French, master of Europe, had limits. But before we march into the frozen wastelands of Russia, let's rewind and ask, why did Napoleon even invade in the first place? What drove him to risk everything? Because at the height of his power in 1812, Napoleon ruled an empire unlike anything Europe had seen since Rome. France itself was his heart, but around it stretched kingdoms and client states: Italy, Spain, the Netherlands, the Confederation of the Rhine, Poland, even allies in Denmark and beyond. Austria and Prussia had been humbled, Britain was blockaded, and Russia was supposed to be his partner. Napoleon and Tsar Alexander V had once stood side by side as allies. They had promised friendship, promised to reshape Europe together. But alliances in this age were fragile, built on convenience, not trust. And by 1810, the cracks were showing. Napoleon's continental system, his grand plan to economically strangle Britain by cutting off trade, was collapsing. Merchants smuggled goods, neutral nations found loopholes, and Russia simply decided to stop obeying. Alexander the Fine reopened trade with Britain. Napoleon saw this not just as betrayal, but as a direct threat to the foundation of his empire. Here's the cliffhanger. Napoleon didn't just want to punish Russia, he had to. If Russia defied him and got away with it, others would follow. His empire would unravel. And so, with the same confidence that had carried him from Corsican obscurity to the throne of France, Napoleon made a decision that would seal his fate. He would march east. He would bring Russia to heel. He would make Tsar Alexander kneel. The army he gathered was staggering. Over 600,000 men, the largest Europe had ever seen. This wasn't just Frenchmen, it was an empire's worth of manpower. Italians, Poles, Germans, Dutch, Spaniards, Croats, even reluctant allies like Austrians forced to contribute troops. Imagine the scene, the summer of 1812, endless columns of men stretching across the horizon, artillery convoys rumbling, cavalry squadrons shimmering in the sun, a tide of humanity moving east. It must have looked unstoppable, a force that could trample nations. And in the center, Napoleon himself, certain of victory. But here's the twist. This army carried within it the seeds of its own destruction. Feeding so many men and horses was nearly impossible. Supply lines stretched thin. Roads were primitive. Every mile forward meant greater vulnerability. And worst of all, Napoleon was marching into a land whose size, climate, and strategy he barely understood. When the Grand Army crossed the Niemen River into Russia in June 1812, Napoleon expected a quick campaign. He expected the Russians to stand and fight, to give him the decisive battle he always craved. But the Russians refused. Instead of fighting, they retreated. They burned fields. They destroyed supplies. They abandoned towns. This scorched earth strategy was as brutal as it was effective. Napoleon's men marched deeper and deeper into enemy territory, but every village they reached was ashes, every field was blackened, every storehouse was empty. Hunger began gnawing at them before they had even fought a major battle. And here's a psychological trigger. Imagine being one of those soldiers. You've marched for weeks, your boots are falling apart, your rations are gone, you're drinking swamp water, eating grass, waiting for the moment when Napoleon will finally deliver you a glorious victory. But instead, day after day, you find nothing. Only smoke on the horizon, only silence where life should be. How long before hope turns into despair? Finally, in September, The Russians stood. At Borodino on September 7, 1812, General Kutuzov gathered his forces and prepared to fight. Napoleon had his battle at last, and what a battle it was! Over 250,000 men clashed in one of the most savage single-day bloodbaths in European history. The earth shook with cannon fire. Muskets roared in endless volleys. Men charged, fell, and were replaced by new waves of flesh and steel. Fortified redoubts changed hands again and again, taken by French bayonets, retaken by desperate Russian counterattacks. The losses were staggering, over 70,000 men killed or wounded in just a few hours. To put that in perspective, that's more than the population of a major city wiped out in a single day. Napoleon technically won the field. The Russians withdrew, but it was a hollow victory. He had not destroyed their army. He had not broken their will. Kutuzov retreated again, leaving the road to Moscow open. Napoleon marched forward, believing the fall of Moscow would end the war. Surely, he thought, the Tsar would surrender once his ancient capital was taken. But when the French entered Moscow on September 14th, they found something eerie. The city was almost empty. Its people had fled, and then fires broke out. Whether set by arsonists, soldiers, or chance, the flames consumed Moscow. Napoleonic chess men watched in horror as the city they thought would feed and shelter them burned to the ground. Here's the engagement hook. Imagine standing in the heart of your enemy's capital. You've fought, bled, starved, marched thousands of miles, and instead of victory, you find only fire. That's the moment when Napoleon's dream began to die. He waited in Moscow for 5 weeks, expecting Tsar Alexander to beg for peace. But the Tsar never did. He refused. He let Napoleon sit, watching his army grow weaker, his supplies dwindle, his hope fade. And then winter came. The retreat from Moscow is one of the most infamous catastrophes in all of history. Picture it. Snow falling in endless sheets, the temperature dropping below freezing, men without coats, horses collapsing, wagons abandoned, soldiers wrapped rags around their feet. Frostbite blackened their fingers. Starvation drove them to madness. Some boiled horse hides for soup, some ate dogs, some turned on their own dead. And all the while, the Russians stalked them. Cossacks swept down on exhausted columns, picking off stragglers, cutting down the weak. Villages along the retreat route were burned before the French could reach them. Every step was suffering. Every mile was death. The crossing of the Berezina River in late November was the final horror. Under fire, the French tried to build makeshift bridges. Thousands drowned in the icy water, trampled in the crush, or were slaughtered by Russian guns. The scenes defy imagination. Men clawing over each other, screaming as they slipped beneath the ice. Soldiers shot as they tried to climb onto rafts already overloaded. Out of the 600,000 men who had entered Russia, fewer than 100,000 made it out alive. 600,000 went in. A fraction came back. The Grand Army, the greatest force Europe had ever seen, was gone. And Napoleon, he abandoned his army before the retreat was finished, rushing back to Paris to preserve his throne. But the myth was shattered. The man who had seemed invincible, the conqueror who had ruled a continent, had been beaten not by generals, but by winter, hunger, and time. Here's the final punch. The invasion of Russia didn't just destroy an army, it destroyed Napoleon's aura of invincibility. It lit a fire across Europe. Austria, Prussia, Britain, Sweden, Spain, they all rose again. Within 2 years, Paris itself would fall, and Napoleon would be forced to abdicate. So what do we take from this story today? The invasion of 1812 isn't just about muskets and cannons. It's about human nature. It's about what happens when ambition blinds judgment, when pride deafens reason, when a man refuses to accept limits. Napoleon thought he could bend the world to his will. Instead, the world broke him. The haunting images remain. Moscow burning like a funeral pyre, soldiers collapsing face first in the snow, the frozen river choked with corpses, the once proud Grand Army reduced to a desperate trickle of survivors. And the most haunting question of all, what if Napoleon had never invaded? Would his empire have lasted? Would Europe look different today? Or was his downfall inevitable, written from the moment he crowned himself emperor and promised himself the world? One decision, one invasion, one winter that changed history forever. This was Napoleon's greatest gamble, and it destroyed him.